The shuttle descended through the docking bay of Station Korth, and Grace Turner pressed her face against the viewport to watch the massive structure grow larger with every passing second. She had never seen anything so enormous in her entire life, and the sight made her heart beat faster with a mixture of excitement and fear that she could not quite name. The Galactic Defense Academy stretched across the void of space like a metal city floating among the stars, and its countless towers and platforms glittered with lights from 1,000 different species who had come here to train as warriors. Grace knew she was about to become one of them, though she also knew that most of the beings on this station would never see her as an equal. She was human, and humans were considered the weakest species in the known galaxy. The shuttle touched down with a gentle thump, and the other passengers began to gather their belongings. Grace noticed how they towered over her. These massive Crixian warriors with their blue skin and 4 eyes, and the slender Nethrani soldiers whose extra arms moved with a grace that seemed almost like dancing. None of them looked at her, and she preferred it that way. She stepped off the shuttle and into a corridor so wide that she could have fit her childhood home inside it 3 times over. The air smelled strange, like metal and something sweet she could not identify, and the lights overhead cast everything in a pale blue glow that made her feel like she was walking underwater. A voice boomed across the arrival hall, and Grace looked up to see a Crixian officer standing on a raised platform. His uniform was covered in medals and ribbons, and his 4 eyes scanned the new arrivals with obvious contempt. "Welcome to Station Korth," Commander Velther announced, his voice echoing off the metal walls. "You have been selected from your respective worlds to train at the finest military academy in the galaxy, and I expect each of you to honor that privilege with dedication and excellence." His gaze swept across the crowd and stopped on Grace. She felt his 4 eyes examining her small frame, her simple clothes, her unremarkable appearance, and she knew exactly what he was thinking. "I see Earth has sent us another volunteer," he said, and laughter rippled through the assembled cadets. "Tell me, human, do your people truly believe that sending your weakest specimens to our academy will somehow make them stronger?" Grace said nothing. She simply stood there with her hands at her sides and her eyes forward, waiting for him to finish. Commander Velther seemed disappointed by her lack of reaction. He had wanted her to argue or cry or show some sign of the weakness he expected from her kind, but she gave him nothing. "Report to processing," he said finally, waving his massive hand in dismissal. "Try not to break anything on your way there." More laughter followed Grace as she walked toward the processing center, but she did not turn around or acknowledge it in any way. She had expected this treatment, and she had prepared herself for much worse. The processing center was a small room filled with scanning equipment and computer terminals. A bored-looking Nethrani officer took her identification chip and plugged it into a reader, then stared at the screen with obvious disinterest. "Grace Turner." The officer read aloud. "Earth origin, North American sector, civilian volunteer status, no military background, no special skills noted." She looked up at Grace with something like pity in her 3 eyes. "You will be assigned to training Tier 7, the lowest tier available." Grace nodded and accepted her room assignment without complaint. She found her quarters at the end of a long corridor in the oldest section of the station. The room was barely larger than a closet, with a thin mattress on a metal frame and a small storage unit for her belongings. She set down her single bag and sat on the bed, listening to the hum of the station around her. A knock came at her door, and she opened it to find a young man with brown hair and tired eyes standing in the hallway. He was human like her, and he wore the same basic cadet uniform that had been waiting on her bed. "You must be the new arrival," he said with a small smile. "I am Daniel Brooks, and I have been here for about 6 months now. I wanted to warn you about a few things before you start training tomorrow." Grace stepped aside to let him in, and Daniel looked around her tiny, room with a knowing expression. "They always give humans the worst quarters," he said. "It is their way of reminding us where we stand in the hierarchy around here." "I noticed," Grace replied. The commander made his feelings about Earth quite clear during the arrival ceremony. Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Commander Velther is actually one of the nicer ones. Wait until you meet Instructor Zorath in combat training. She is a Nethrani with 4 arms and absolutely no patience for what she calls our biological limitations." Grace listened carefully as Daniel explained the daily routine at the academy. She learned that human cadets were expected to perform menial tasks that other species consider beneath them, and that the instructors took special pleasure in designing exercises that highlighted human weaknesses. "Most humans wash out within the first 3 months," Daniel admitted. "I have survived this long by keeping my head down and never complaining about anything. My advice to you is to do the same." Grace thanked him for the information and watched him leave. She stood alone in her small room and thought about everything she had seen and heard. Since arriving on the station, the other cadets saw her as weak and worthless, and the instructors viewed her presence as an insult to their prestigious academy. They expected her to fail, and they would do everything in their power to ensure that she did. But Grace Turner had secrets that none of them could imagine, and she had not come to Station Korath to prove herself to anyone. She had come here for reasons that existed far above their understanding, and she was prepared to endure whatever humiliation they threw at her until the moment arrived for her to reveal the truth. She unpacked her single bag and arranged a few possessions in the storage unit. Tomorrow would bring the first day of training, and she needed to rest. The station hummed around her as she lay down on the thin mattress and closed her eyes. Somewhere in the depths of this massive structure, an ancient vault sat waiting in the darkness, sealed for 300 years, and Grace Turner was the only being in the galaxy who could open it, but that was a secret she would keep for as long as necessary, even if it meant enduring the laughter of every instructor and cadet on Station Korath. The first week of training was exactly as brutal as Daniel had warned her it would be, and Grace found herself pushed to the absolute limits of her physical endurance every single day. Instructor Zorath seemed to take special pleasure in designing exercises that were nearly impossible for human bodies to complete, and she watched Grace struggle with obvious amusement. "Again," Zorath commanded. Her 4 arms crossed over her chest as Grace attempted to climb the vertical obstacle course for the 7th time that morning. "A Nethrani child could complete this course in half the time you have taken." Human Grace said nothing and continued climbing. Her muscles screamed in protest, and her lungs burned with every breath. But she refused to give up or ask for rest. The other cadets watched from below, laughing and making jokes about the weak Earthborn who could barely lift herself from one platform to the next. Grace ignored them all and focused only on reaching the top. She fell twice more before finally completing the course, and by the time she reached the ground, her arms were shaking so badly that she could barely stand. Instructor Zorath looked at her with something that might have been disappointment or disgust. "You completed the course," Zorath admitted, "but your time was pathetic, and your form was an embarrassment to this academy. Report to the equipment storage and spend the rest of the morning cleaning the training weapons." Grace nodded and walked away without complaint. Cleaning weapons was considered the lowest task at the academy, suitable only for cadets who had failed to meet expectations, and the instructors assigned it to her almost every day. But Grace did not mind the work. It gave her time to think and observe, and she learned many things about the station and its inhabitants while scrubbing plasma rifles and polishing combat blades. She learned that the Crixians valued strength above all else and considered any form of weakness to be a moral failing. She learned that the Nethrani prided themselves on their speed and precision and looked down on species who could not match their agility. She learned that dozens of other species attended the academy, each with their own prejudices and hierarchies, and that humans sat at the very bottom of them. All Daniel found her in the storage room one afternoon and sat down beside her with a concerned expression on his face. I've been here for 3 weeks now," he said quietly, "and you have not complained once about the way they treat you." Most humans would have broken down by now or requested a transfer back to Earth. Grace continued polishing the blade in her hands and shrugged. "Complaining would not change anything, and I have no interest in going back to Earth. I came here to learn, and that is what I intend to do." Daniel studied her face for a long moment. "There is something different about you, Grace. I have watched you during training, and I have noticed things that the instructors seem to miss." Grace looked up at him with careful curiosity. "What kind of things?" "The way you move when you think no one is paying attention," Daniel said. "Your footwork during combat drills is too precise for someone with no military background. You know exactly where every person in the room is standing at all times, even when your back is turned. And yesterday, when that Crixian cadet tried to trip you in the hallway, you dodged him without even looking." Grace held his gaze for several seconds before returning her attention to the blade. "I grew up on a farm in Kansas. The only thing I learned to dodge was my older brother when he wanted to wrestle." Daniel did not look convinced, but he did not press the issue. Instead, he changed the subject to something that had been bothering him for the past few days. "Have you heard the rumors about the Vault of Origins?" He asked. Grace kept her expression neutral. "I have heard people mention it, but no one seems to know much about what it actually contains. It is supposedly the oldest part of this station," Daniel explained. "The founders of the Galactic Accord built it 300 years ago, and they sealed something inside that has never been opened since. The original access protocols were lost generations ago, and no living being has the clearance to enter." "Why are people talking about it now?" Grace asked, though she already knew the answer. "Strange energy readings," Daniel said. "The sensors near the vault have been going crazy for the past few weeks, and nobody can figure out why. Some people think the power systems in that section are finally failing after all these centuries, but others believe something inside is waking up." Grace finished polishing the blade and set it aside. "What do you think is in there?" Daniel shrugged. "I have no idea, and honestly, I do not care. I am just trying to survive long enough to complete my training and return to Earth with some useful skills. Ancient vaults and mysterious artifacts are above my pay grade." Grace nodded and picked up another weapon to clean. Daniel watched her for a moment longer before standing up to leave. "Be careful, Grace," he said from the doorway. "This station has more secrets than anyone realizes, and I get the feeling that you might be one of them." He left before she could respond, and Grace sat alone in the storage room with her thoughts. Daniel was observant, more observant than she had expected, and she would need to be more careful about concealing her abilities, but she could not hide everything forever. The Vault of Origins was becoming unstable, and the time was approaching when she would need to reveal the truth about who she really was and why Earth had sent her to this station for now. Though, she would continue to play the role of the weak Earthborn cadet who could barely complete a training exercise. She would endure the mockery and the menial tasks and the constant reminders of human inferiority, and when the moment came, she would show them all exactly what humanity was capable of. The explosion ripped through the eastern docking bay at exactly 3 in the morning, and Grace was already awake when the alarms began to scream throughout the station. She had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something that she had known was coming for a very long time. She dressed quickly and stepped into the corridor to find chaos erupting all around her. Cadets were running in every direction, some still half asleep and confused, others shouting orders that no one seemed to follow. The lights flickered overhead, and another explosion shook the floor beneath her feet. Daniel appeared at her side, his face pale with fear. "The station is under attack," he shouted over the noise of the alarms. Someone breached the outer defenses and launched an assault on the docking bays. "Who?" Grace asked, though she already suspected the answer. "The Hollow Sovereignty," Daniel replied. "They are a rogue faction that broke away from the Crixian Empire about 50 years ago. Everyone thought they were destroyed, but apparently they have been rebuilding in secret." Grace nodded and started moving toward the central corridor that led deeper into the station. Daniel grabbed her arm and tried to pull her in the opposite direction. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "The evacuation points are the other way. We need to get to the escape pods before the attackers reach this section. The escape pods will be the first targets they hit," Grace said calmly. "If you want to survive, stay close to me and do exactly what I tell you." Daniel stared at her with confusion and fear, but something in her voice made him release her arm and follow. They moved through the corridors together, weaving between panicked cadets and fallen debris, and Grace led them deeper into the station with a certainty that seemed impossible. For someone who had only been there for a few weeks, they rounded a corner and found themselves face to face with two Hollow Sovereignty soldiers. The attackers were Crixian, massive and heavily armed, and they raised their weapons the moment they spotted the two humans. Grace moved before Daniel could even process what was happening. She ducked under the first soldier's weapon and drove her palm into a pressure point beneath his arm, causing him to drop his rifle with a howl of pain. She caught the falling weapon and swung it like a club into the second soldier's knee, bringing him down to her level, then delivered a precise strike to his temple that knocked him unconscious. The first soldier tried to grab her, but she twisted away from his reach and used his own momentum to throw him against the wall. He slumped to the ground, stunned, and Grace retrieved both weapons before turning back to Daniel. "Are you hurt?" she asked. Daniel shook his head, but his eyes were wide with shock. "How did you do that?" "You took down two Crixian soldiers in less than 5 seconds, and they were twice your size." Grace handed him one of the rifles. "I told you to stay close and do what I say. We need to keep moving." They continued through the station, and Grace disabled 3 more attackers along the way. Daniel watched her with growing amazement, trying to reconcile the skilled warrior in front of him with the weak Earthborn cadet who had scrubbed training. Equipment without complaint for the past month, they reached the central command hub and found Commander Velther rallying a group of instructors for a counterattack. His uniform was torn, and blue blood dripped from a wound on his forehead, but his 4 eyes still burned with determination. "The attackers are pushing toward the intersections," Velther announced. "They have overwhelming numbers, and our defenses are failing. We need to hold them here until reinforcements arrive from the nearest patrol fleet." Instructor Zorath stood beside him, her 4 arms gripping weapons of different types. "We have received reports that the enemy leader is someone called Draven. He was a warlord who served the old Crixian Empire before the sovereignty broke away, and he is supposed to be extremely dangerous. What does he want?" One of the other instructors asked. "The Vault of Origins," Velther replied grimly. "Our intelligence suggests that Draven believes there is a weapon inside the vault that could give him power over the entire galaxy. He has been searching for a way to open it for decades." Grace stepped forward, and every eye in the room turned to look at her. Commander Velther recognized her immediately, and his expression shifted from surprise to contempt. "What are you doing here, human?" he demanded. "This is a command briefing, not a place for the weakest cadet in the academy to hide from battle. The vault cannot be opened by force," Grace said quietly. "It uses a lineage protocol that was embedded in the founding charter of the Galactic Accord. Only someone carrying a specific genetic key can activate the entrance." The room fell silent. Velther stared at her with his 4 eyes narrowed in suspicion. "How do you know this?" he asked. Before Grace could answer, High Arbiter Tanix limped into the command hub. He was the ancient administrator of the academy, older than anyone could remember, and he looked like he had barely survived an encounter with the attackers. "She knows because she is the key," Tanix said, his voice weak but certain. "I suspected the truth when I reviewed her file, but I could not confirm it until now. The genetic markers are unmistakable." Commander Velther looked between Grace and the High Arbiter with obvious confusion. "What are you talking about? She is just a civilian volunteer from Earth. Her file shows nothing special about her at all. Our public file shows nothing special," Tanix corrected. "But her classified file tells a very different story. And if Draven reaches that vault before we do, the consequences will be catastrophic for the entire galaxy." Another explosion shook the station, and the lights flickered dangerously. Grace knew that time was running out and that she could not maintain her cover any longer. "I need to reach the vault before Draven does," she said. "Can you tell me the fastest route from here?" Tanix pointed toward a corridor on the far side of the hub. "That passage leads directly to the vault chamber, but it will be heavily guarded by now. Draven's forces have been pushing in that direction since the attack began." Grace nodded and started toward the corridor. Daniel moved to follow her, and after a moment of hesitation, Commander Velther and Instructor Zorth fell in behind them as well. "I do not know who you really are," Velther said as they ran. "But if you can stop Draven from opening that vault, I will personally apologize for every insult I have ever directed at your species." Grace did not respond. She simply ran faster, knowing that the fate of the galaxy depended on what happened in the next few minutes. The corridor leading to the Vault of Origins was filled with the sounds of battle, and Grace could hear Draven's forces attempting to breach the ancient door as she approached. She moved quickly and silently, with Commander Velther and the others struggling to keep up with her pace. They encountered resistance twice along the way, and Grace disabled the enemy soldiers with a speed and precision that left the alien instructors speechless. Instructor Zorth watched her take down a Crixian warrior 3 times her size using nothing but her bare hands. And the Nethrani combat trainer finally understood that everything she had believed about this human cadet was completely wrong. They reached the final corridor and found a scene of desperate activity. Draven stood before the massive vault door with a dozen soldiers surrounding him, and several technicians were working frantically to crack the entrance using stolen override codes. Draven himself was enormous, even by Crixian standards, with scars covering his blue skin and eyes that burned with ambition and hatred. He had been a legendary warlord before founding the Hollow Sovereignty, and the stories of his cruelty had spread across the entire galaxy. "It is not working," one of the technicians reported. "The door rejects every code we try. The security protocols are unlike anything I have ever seen." Draven grabbed the technician by the throat and lifted him off the ground. "I did not come this far to be stopped by a locked door. Find a way to open it, or I will find someone who can." He threw the technician aside and turned his attention to the vault itself. The door was ancient and massive, covered in symbols from a language that had not been spoken in 300 years. And it hummed with a power that seemed almost alive. Grace stepped into the corridor, and Draven's soldiers spotted her immediately. They raised their weapons and laughed at the sight of a small human woman walking toward them without fear. "Look at this," one of the soldiers called out. "The Academy sends their weakest cadet to stop us. They must be truly desperate." Draven turned to look at Grace, and something in his scarred face changed. He studied her with an intensity that suggested he saw something the others did not. "Hold your fire," he commanded. "Let her approach." Grace walked forward until she stood only a few meters from the warlord. Commander Velther shouted for her to stop, but she ignored him completely. "You are not just a cadet," Draven said slowly. "I can see it in the way you move and the way you hold yourself. Who are you really, human?" Grace did not answer him. Instead, She continued walking toward the vault door, passing between his soldiers as if they did not exist. "Stop her," Draven ordered, but Grace was already at the door. She placed her hand on the biometric scanner, and the ancient system activated with a sound like thunder rolling across mountains. The scanner examined her palm, then her retina, then reached deep into her genetic code to find the markers that had been hidden there for generations. The symbols on the door began to glow, and a voice that had not spoken in 3 centuries echoed through the corridor. "Identity verification in progress." The voice announced, "Accessing classified personnel file. Genetic lineage confirmed." The display above the scanner illuminated with words that made every being in the corridor freeze in shock. "Identity confirmed. Grace Turner, direct descendant of Admiral Catherine Turner, founding architect of the Galactic Accord and original designer of Station Korth. Lineage protocol active. Full vault access granted." The massive doors began to open, revealing a chamber filled with ancient technology and soft blue light. Grace stepped inside without hesitation, and Draven's roar of fury echoed behind her. "Seize her," the warlord screamed. "Do not let her activate anything in there." But it was too late. Grace had already reached the central console, a command interface that controlled systems throughout the entire station. She placed both hands on the controls, and the technology recognized her touch instantly. "Welcome, descendant of the founder," the ancient voice said. "All station systems are now available for your command. How may I serve you?" Grace looked at the display and saw options that made her heart race with possibility. The station's original defense network had been dormant for 300 years, waiting for someone with the proper authority to reactivate it. And now that authority belonged to her, activate all dormant defense systems, she commanded. Target hostile forces throughout the station and neutralize them. Protect all Academy personnel and cadets. Confirmed, the voice replied. Defense systems activating now. The station came alive around them. Hidden turrets emerged from walls and ceilings throughout every corridor, and emergency barriers began sealing off sections where Hollow Sovereignty soldiers were concentrated. The sounds of weapon fire and screaming filled the air as Draven's forces found themselves trapped and overwhelmed by defenses they never knew existed. Raven charged into the vault chamber with his massive blade raised, his scarred face twisted with rage. "I will not be denied by some pathetic human," he screamed. "This station and everything in it will be mine." He swung the blade at Grace's head with enough force to cut through metal, but she was no longer the weak cadet he had dismissed. She moved with the training of an elite operative, ducking under his strike and positioning herself inside his guard commander. Velther and Instructor Zorath watched from the corridor entrance as Grace engaged the most dangerous warlord in the galaxy. They wanted to help, but they could not risk interfering with the defense systems that were saving their lives. Grace dodged another swing and struck Draven 3 times in rapid succession, hitting pressure points that would have incapacitated any normal being. The warlord staggered but did not fall, his Crixian physiology protecting him from damage that would have killed a lesser creature. "You are strong for a human," Draven admitted, "but I have killed thousands of warriors from dozens of species. One small Earthborn female will not be my end." He attacked again, faster this time, and Grace felt the blade pass within centimeters of her face. She knew she could not match his strength or endurance, so she would have to rely on something else. She remembered her training, the years of preparation that had led her to this moment, and she let her body move without conscious thought. Her strikes became faster and more precise, targeting the specific vulnerabilities of Crixian anatomy that most species did not know existed. Revan faltered, his movements becoming slower and less coordinated as Grace systematically disabled his ability to fight. She drove her palm into his chest with perfect technique, and the warlord crashed to the floor with a sound like thunder. Grace stood over him, breathing hard but victorious, and looked down at the creature who had terrorized the galaxy for decades. "It is over," she said quietly. "Your forces are defeated, and you will answer for your crimes before the Galactic Accord." Draven glared up at her with hatred burning in his eyes. "Who are you?" he demanded. "No simple cadet could have done what you just did." Grace turned away from him and walked back to the command console. The answer to his question would come soon enough, but she had more important matters to attend to first. The battle for Station Korath ended within 30 minutes of Grace activating the defense systems, and the Hollow Sovereignty forces were either captured or eliminated by the ancient technology that had slept beneath the station for 3 centuries. Draven was taken to the detention center in restraints designed for the most dangerous prisoners in the galaxy, and his reign of terror was finally over. Grace stood in the Vault of Origins, surrounded by technology that her ancestor had helped create, and she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection before facing the questions that she knew were coming. The blue light of the chamber cast soft shadows across her face, and she could almost feel the presence of Admiral Catherine Turner watching over her commander. Velther entered the chamber with Instructor Zorath and High Arbiter Tanix behind him. His uniform was torn and stained with blood, both his own and that of his enemies. But he walked with a humility that Grace had never seen in him before. "I owe you an apology," Velther said, and the words seemed to cause him physical pain. "I mocked you from the moment you arrived on this station. I called you weak and worthless and questioned why Earth would send someone like you to our academy." He lowered his massive head in a gesture of submission the Crixians reserved for those they considered their superiors. "I was wrong," he continued. "You saved this station and everyone on it. You defeated Draven in single combat, a feat that most warriors in the galaxy would consider impossible. And you did it all while we treated you with contempt and disrespect." Grace looked at him with an expression that held no anger or resentment. "You treated me the way you were taught to treat humans. The fault lies with the galaxy's assumptions about my species, not with you personally." Instructor Zora stepped forward and crossed all 4 of her arms in a gesture of profound respect. "I have trained warriors from dozens of species over my career, and I have never seen anyone move the way you did during that fight. Where did you learn such techniques?" "I am an operative for Earth's Interstellar Security Division," Grace explained. "I was trained from childhood in combat, espionage, and survival techniques. My assignment here was to monitor potential threats to human interests in this sector." High Arbiter Tanix nodded slowly. "I suspected something like this when I reviewed your classified file. The genetic markers identifying you as a descendant of Admiral Turner were unmistakable. But I could not understand why Earth would send someone so important to our academy under false pretenses. The vault was becoming unstable," Grace said. "Earth's intelligence services detected the energy fluctuations months ago and realized that someone would eventually try to breach it. They sent me here to protect the station and ensure that whatever is inside the vault does not fall into the wrong hands." She turned to the command console and activated a display that showed the history of the Galactic Accord. Images of the founding species appeared on the screen, including humans working alongside Crixians and Nethrani and dozens of other races. 300 years ago, Admiral Catherine Turner was one of the primary architects of the Galactic Accord, Grace explained. She designed the original defense systems for this station and embedded a genetic failsafe in the vault that would only respond to her descendants. The other founding species agreed to this arrangement because they trusted her judgment. Commander Velther stared at the display with obvious shock. "I was taught that humans were late arrivals to the galactic community, that you joined the Accord only after the other species had established the foundations of our civilization. That is the story your people chose to remember," Grace replied. "The truth is that humanity was instrumental in creating the Accord. We provided the diplomatic framework that allowed so many different species to cooperate. And we designed the security protocols that have protected this station for 3 centuries. She paused and looked at each of the alien officers in turn. But over time, the other species forgot. They saw human physical limitations and assumed that we had nothing valuable to contribute. They rewrote history to minimize our role and treated us as inferior beings who were lucky to be included in galactic society. Instructor Zorath made a sound of disbelief. How could such important history be forgotten? It was not forgotten, Tanik said quietly. It was deliberately erased. I have access to the oldest archives on this station, and I have seen records that contradict everything we teach about human involvement in the Accord. Someone made a decision long ago to diminish humanity's contributions, and the rest of the galaxy accepted it without question. Daniel Brooks appeared in the doorway of the vault chamber. He looked exhausted and overwhelmed, but his eyes were bright with the kind of wonder that comes from watching everything you thought you knew turn out to be wrong. So all this time, he said slowly, all the mockery and the insults and the assumptions about human weakness, it was all based on a lie? Grace nodded. Humans have always been underestimated. Our physical bodies are fragile compared to other species, but our minds and our spirits are stronger than anyone realizes. We survived on a death world that would have killed most other forms of life. And we developed technology and civilization despite challenges that should have wiped us out 1,000 times over. She walked toward the group gathered at the chamber entrance and stopped in front of Commander Velther. I did not come here to prove anything to you or anyone else, she said. I came here to do my job and protect this station. The fact that I had to endure your contempt along the way was simply part of the mission. Velther met her gaze with his 4 eyes and seemed to struggle with something deep inside himself. What happens now? He asked. Now the truth comes out, Grace replied. The Galactic Accord will receive a full report about what happened here, including the revelation of humanity's true role in the founding of this civilization. The other species will have to decide whether they want to continue treating humans as lesser beings, or whether they are ready to accept us as the equals we have always been. She looked back at the vault one last time before turning to leave. My work here is done. I will return to Earth and await my next assignment. Instructor Zorath moved to block her path, not in a threatening way, but with genuine concern in her 3 eyes. You can't simply leave after everything that has happened. This station owes you a debt that can never be repaid. Then repay it by remembering what you learned today, Grace said. Remember that appearances can be deceiving and that the weakest-looking being in the room might be the one who saves your life. Teach that lesson to your cadets, and perhaps the next human who comes to this academy will not have to endure what I did. She walked out of the vault chamber and into the corridor beyond, leaving behind a group of alien warriors who would never look at humanity the same way again. Daniel caught up with her as she reached the main corridor. I knew there was something different about you, he said with a tired smile. But I never imagined anything like this. Grace allowed herself a small smile in return. Earth remembers what the galaxy forgot. We have been keeping secrets for 300 years, waiting for the right moment to remind everyone who we really are. She continued walking toward the docking bay, where a transport ship would take her home. And she knew that the galaxy would never be the same after today. The instructors had laughed at the weak Earthborn, but they would not be laughing anymore. Humanity had finally stepped out of the shadows, and the universe would have to make room.